Today's daf is daf Hey, and we're trying to figure out if a mumar la'avodah zara, in a case where we don't know that he violates other of the prohibitions of the Torah, but he definitely is an idol worshiper, can we trust his shechita? And the Gemara had quoted Rav Hanan, who was of the opinion that we can rely on his shechita, and the Gemara is in the middle now here on daf Hey and Aleph of trying to prove to support Rav Hanan based on a story about a covenant between Achav, who was an idol worshiper, and Yoshaphat, Melech Yehuda. And that covenant was made in order to join forces between Yisrael and Yehuda to fight against Aram. And the Gemara says the following: is it possible that really Yehoshaphat did not trust and rely on Achav's shechita, and therefore there's no proof from the fact that Achav prepared this great lavish Suda with all the bakar and so forth that Yehoshaphat actually ate from the Suda, and the Gemara rejects that possibility here. Lo havi maflig nafshe mineh. In other words, it would seem, says the Gemara from Tanakh, that Yehoshaphat had a very close relationship with Achav, and he relied on him totally, and therefore he would have eaten from the meat. And even though Yehoshaphat was a tzaddik, the very fact that he ate from the meat is proof positive to support Rav Hanan that even though Achav's status is that of a mumar la'avodah zarah, nevertheless we can eat from his shechita. And the Gemara says, Minolan, how do you know that the relationship between Yehoshaphat and Achav was so close that Achav certainly relied on him and trusted him for everything? If it's from the pasuk Kamoni Kamocha, which seems to compare the two of them, that we are like the same, Ki ami ki amecha, and my people are like your people, which sounds like Yehoshaphat is saying my people are no better than your people, and therefore, in all matters, like even something like shechita, I can certainly rely on you. Elameata, but if that be the case, what are you going to do with the next part of the same pasuk? It says there, Kisusai kisusecha. My horses are like your horses. And that seems to be an equation on a level of going out to battle, and a military prowess has nothing to do with ritual law like shechita. Is hachinami, how are you going to stretch that pasuk out to mean that we have equality, says Yehoshaphat to Achav, in matters of law? Elamai dahavi asusecha tehevi asusi. The simple pshat in the pasuk is that if we go together to battle with this covenant, then whatever happens to your horses happen to my horses, and vice versa. In other words, whatever happens in battle happens to both of us because we're together. It's hochinami. Now, if we go back to the beginning of the pasuk, we should apply the same logic, the same yardstick. Mai dahavi aloch v'iluyeh amecha tehevi olai v'iluyach. Whatever chances upon you, whatever happens to you as we go to battle in Aram, it's as if he happened to me, because we're making this union in a military contract that connects your people and my people. So therefore, if you want to prove that Yehoshaphat relied on Achav even for shechita, to eat from his meat, then prove it from the following pasuk: Melech Yisrael. That's a reference to Achav. Yehoshaphat, who is the tzaddik, the Melech Yehuda, Yoshvim ish al kiso milubashim begadim begoren. Begoren Pesach Shar Shomron. So both Yehoshaphat and Achav were each on their throne, dressed in royal begadim, on a threshing floor, which is called a goren, at the entrance to the gates of Shomron. Now, it's not possible that we're talking about a threshing floor literally, if you take it literally, that is located at the entrance to Shomron. Because, as the Ritva points out, there's no heter to set up a threshing hall within 50 amas of a city. That has to do with Harchokas Nezikin. So therefore, my Goran, Ilem Goran Mamish, Otu Shar Shomer Goran, however, there's no way that you could suggest that there was a threshing floor at the gate of Shomron, Ella Ki Goran, but rather the word Goran should be understood metaphorically as an allusion to Sanhedrin, because Sanhedrin, the Mishnah tells us at the beginning of Sanhedrin, the members of the court would sit in a semicircle, which is called Chatzi Goren. Sanhedrin Hoysa Kechatzi Goren Agula, Kidei Sheyu Roim Zedzeh. It was critical that all the members of Sanhedrin would see each other and learn from their facial expressions, etc., etc. And therefore, the word Goren is an allusion here to a special relationship that is compared to the relationship of the members of Sanhedrin that see each other and they work together out of love and friendship. And so too is the relationship between Yoshafat and Achav. And therefore, the assumption is that Yoshafat would have eaten from the meat that was prepared by Achav, even though Achav is an idol worship. So now we have, at this point, a back and forth as to whether we have a proof to Rav Hanan's theory about relying on the shechita of an oved avodah zarah, and therefore it's sort of like up in the air, but we have defended this proof, and it could be that we can accept the proof from Yoshafat and Achav. But we'd rather bring a stronger proof. Lema Masayele, let's bring a pasuk to support Rav Hanan in an unequivocal way. And this has to do with Eliyahu Novi and the food that was brought to Eliyahu Novi, which included meat, was transported to Eliyahu Novi by Orvim, by the ravens. In fact, Rashi in Chumash, you may recall, in the Parsha of Noach, when Noach wanted to send out the raven from the teva, and the raven didn't want to go out of the teva. So the raven argued that if you think, Noach, that I'm your shliach, my purpose is to be a shliach of Eliyahu Hanavi. Anyway, so ha'orvim mivim lo lechem ubasar ba'boker v'lechem ubasar ba'erev. So they brought to Eliyahu Hanavi both bread and meat. And where did this meat come from? Amar Rav Yehuda Marav mi beit habochi di Achav. It actually came from the slaughterhouse or the kitchen of Achav. So it means the meat was slaughtered by the staff of Achav, and yet Eliyahu Hanavi ate of this meat. Obviously, we could rely on an Oved Avodah Zarah like Achav, an idol worshiper, for the sake of Shechita. So Gemara says, no, Al Pia Dibur Shiny. God had designated this raven with a mission to bring this bread and meat to Eliyahu. And that was part of the promise that Hashem gave to Eliyahu from the get-go. And therefore could be that this is a special dispensation that allowed Eliyahu Hanavi to eat from the meat based on the fact that Hashem said, I will provide you with this meat. And the Gemara now wants to know what the word Orvim means. My Orvim. Amar Avina Orvim Mamish, that these were actual ravens. Now, keep in mind the halacha is, this is Sugyan Avodah Zarah, that if a bird would bring meat from someplace, you're not allowed to eat that meat. Even if you assume he got it in a kosher place, we don't know for sure. It's called Basar Hashanis Ali Mina Ayin, if you remember that sugi at the end of Avodah Zarah, that if you don't constantly watch your meat and it's under strict surveillance, then you always have to be afraid that maybe it was switched with other meat, which is not kosher. And yet, even though if we take the interpretation of Ravina, meaning Orvim Mamish, that these ravens, these birds, brought the meat to Elio, and therefore would be Bosash and Salamina Ayin, and therefore Elio should not be able to eat it. But the only reason he ate it is because of the special dispensation, which is called Al Pi Dibur Shaini. But Vidilma Trey Gavni Dahavishmayahu Omar Le Rav Ada Bar Minyomi. Rav Ada turns to Ravina. He says, "How do you know that this pasuk is referring to Arvim Mamish? That these were real birds? Maybe there were two people who had the name Arvim, meaning each one had the name Orev, and we're going to try to prove from Tanakh that Orev is the name of a person." And there were two of them, and therefore it says Arvim in the plural. Harvim Mivim Lo, etc. So the Gemara says, Ki lo ksiv vayahargu es ha'orev, b'tzur orev. There's a place on the map that's called Tzur Orev. V'es se'ev chulei. So it would seem from this pasuk that there was a person by the name of Orev, and he was killed in a place called Tzur Orev. Amalei Ravina says, you know what? You want to say that we're not talking about Orvim, but rather people by the name of Orvim, Isramai Milsa de Travayu Havishmaya. Orvim, could it really be possible statistically that two people who are given the commission to bring the bread and the meat from to Elio were both had the same quirky name Orev? That's kind of far-fetched. So the Gemara says, but Vidilma al Shem Mekoman. Why do you think it's so rare to have two people with the same strange name? Maybe they both came from the same place, which is called Tzur Arvim. And therefore this was a popular name in that locale, and therefore they both have to have the same strange name. And the Gemara wants to support this by quoting another pasuk, Mi lo ksiv ve'aram yatsu gedudim vayishbu me'eretz Yisrael nara ktana. Now, Nara is a girl who's a teenager. She's like 12 and a half and above, or I should say 12 and above. And Ktana is a girl who's a little tot. She's less than 12 years old. And therefore, Kashale, Korile Nara, the Korile Ktana, how could you swallow both in one breath that she's a Nara and a Ktana? Either she's a Nara or a Ktana. However, Omar Apidos, Ktana, that doesn't mean Ktana. Demin Neoron. In other words, she was a Ktana. Again, there's a whole story in Tanakh how she was captured by the Goyim. But anyway, Demin Neoron. She came from a place called Neoron, and that's why the pasuk uses the word Nara, when really, in fact, she was a Ktana. But she's called a Nara because she came from Neoron. But anyway, we see that names are given to people based on the place that they live or they came from. And therefore, if we apply that in the case of Tzur Orev, it could be that two people came from Tzur Orev by the name of Orev, and therefore in plural there were Orvin, but it's human beings. It's not birds. And then if they were human beings, they would testify about the Shechita. Imkena Orviim miboil. It should have said Orviim if you want to be medayik in the digduk. And therefore, at this point, it would seem that Ravina has the upper hand. We don't believe that there were two men who carried the meat and they both came from Tzur Orev and had the same name Orev, and therefore Orviv, because then it would have said Orviim. And at this point, again, we still have a proof for Ravanan that's very, very shaky. We don't know whether or not you could rely on the shechita of an idol worshiper. But maybe I'll bring you a stronger proof to support Ravanan from a Bryce. The Bryce says, "Akol shoftim afilu kusi afilu orel afilu Yisrael mumar." Okay, now let's try to figure out who this Orel is. You may recall that yesterday we mentioned hemophiliac, right? Hi Arv Hechidomi Ilev Shemesu Achiv Machmas Mila. Two of his brothers had already died as a result of circumcision. Apparently, there's a genetic disease in the family, and therefore the third child was not circumcised. He's called an Orel. Gemara says that can't be. Hi Yisrael Ma'al Yehu. You can't tell me that the Bryce wants to be machadesh to give us a new novel idea that we never would have entertained, that you can rely on the shechit of an orel. This guy's not an orel. An orel is someone who's obligated in milah and hasn't circumcised himself. This individual is not obligated in milah. Ela pshita. So now we have to come up with another interpretation of orel, and that is mumar le'orlus. Meaning that even though he refuses to undergo circumcision, maybe he holds that it's too, it's too bizarre, or maybe he holds that it'll interfere with him, or, he doesn't want the pain of undergoing circumcision, whatever it is. But he's an orel, a real orel. He's chayav to remove his orelus, and he refuses to do so. And yet, the Tana of the Brisa says, Hakol shoftim afilu orel. So now we're talking about a mumar la'arelus. And if a mumar la'arelus, we can rely on his shechita because he's only a mumar l'davar echad, let's apply the same yardstick to support Rav Hanan's ruling that if a person is a mumar la'avodas kol chavim, then he's not a mumar l'kol tarkula, and we can rely on his shechita. But the Gemara says, Amos Seifa. The Seifa of that same price says, Afilu Yisrael mumar. Isn't that a repetition of what we just said? We were talking about an Orel, and we said he was a Mumar la'arlos, and now it says Afil Yisrael Mumar. Hechidami, I Mumar l'davar echad, hainu Mumar la'arelos. If he's, he rebels against the Torah with regard to one mitzvah or one isur, then that's exactly what an Orel is, because we just finished saying that an Orel refuses to undergo milah. Elalav, it must be that there's a great chiddush here in this brisa, which will support Rav Hanan, that we're talking about a mumar lavodas kol chavim. Meaning, you might say, okay, if he's a mumar to one of the lower, lesser violations that are not so severe, fine, we'll accept his shechita, but not an idol worshiper. And that's what the brisa is telling me. No, we can rely on the shechita even of a mumar lavodas zara. Rav Hanan. And now we have a good, solid proof for Rav Hanan. Lo, the Gemara says even this is not a good, solid proof. And I'm going to tell you the logic why we're fighting against Rav Hanan. And we're not going to be willing to accept the shechita of a mumar lavodas zara. I'll tell you why. Because chamura avodas kol cham shekol kofer bav kemode bechol tarkul v'kol hamodeba ki'ilu kofer b'kol tarkul. That means that avodah zarah stands on its own, like shakel keneged kulam. It's not a mumar l'davar echad, and then you could say, well, he's not a mumar l'kol tarkula, he just didn't circumcise himself, whatever. But no, we're talking about someone who's basically a mumar l'kol tarkula because the violation of idolatry is tantamount to denying the entire Torah. Ela mumar lo sedavar k'derava. So what mumar is therefore the brisa referring to? It can't be a mumar la'avodah zara, because if it's a mumar la'avodah zara, then he's a mumar l'kol tarkula. We certainly could treat him as a guy l'chol dinim, and we can't rely on his shechita. So then, what is mumar? It's a mumar li'oso davar, meaning it's worse than what we said a mumar who refuses to undergo circumcision, but rather it's a mumar who will eat non-kosher food. And you may recall that we said yesterday on Daf Daled that according to Rava, even though he eats nevela and treifa, but nevertheless he only does it l'teyava, for gain or benefit. He doesn't have access to kosher food. Says Rava, therefore we can rely on his shechita, again under certain conditions, We may have to check the knife out. We may have to give him a piece of meat to eat, and so forth and so on, whatever the conditions are. And we'll rely on the shechita of a mumer l'dover which means he's a mumer for nevela. Meisvei. Now, until now, we've been making effort after effort to try to support Rav Hanan. Now the Gemara switches it around and quotes a brisa to challenge Rav Hanan and try to prove that, as we said before, chamura avodah zara, it's more chamer than any aver, and he becomes a mumer l'kol kula. Meisvei. The pasuk says mikem. Let's see if we could read the whole pasuk. Right at the very beginning of Sefer Vayikra, Daber el bnei Yisrael v'amart aleim Adam ki Yaakov mikem karbon, etc. Mikem is a mute. V'lo mikulchem, only from amongst you, but not from all of you. So who's being excluded here from shchitas karbanos? He can't bring a carbon. Lahotzias hamumar. A mumar cannot bring a carbon. And let's assume right now that we're talking about a carbon adova, a voluntary carbon. Why should we get involved in bringing the carbon of a mumar when it's a voluntary carbon anyway? And that's what the Pasuk Mikem is coming to exclude. We will not accept an elective or donated carbon from a mumar. Now the Brisa continues and derives another conclusion from the same word mikem. Bachem chilakti v'lo be'umos. This distinction that we've excluded a carbon from a mumar only applies to a Jew. With regard to a guy, it makes no difference. We're not going to check his tzitzis out. We don't care whether he, accepts the Torah and so forth and so on. It doesn't matter. We will accept his carbon. And then the pasuk says, we didn't read the whole pasuk, but it says, Ki Yaakov v'ken karbon Hashem min habehema min habakar. Min habehema lahavi b'nei adam shedomim lebehema. So it seems that the word behema in this context is pejorative. But the chiddush is that min habehema is a ribui to establish that we can accept a carbon from someone who deviates from the Torah law like a behema. Why is he compared to a behema? That's a humiliating description to tell you that he's a poshe. He's a posheah. Mikana Amru Mekablin, right? The ribui of min habehema says even min habehema. We're talking about someone who sins, and nevertheless Mekablin karbanos mi poshe Yisrael. And why? Why do we want to take a carbon from this fellow who violates the Torah? He's one of the sinners of Israel. And the answer is for the same reason that we invite these Poshe Yisrael on Leil Yom Kippur to join us in asking Hashem for kapara. So the Poshe Yisrael should be invited to participate in the process of bringing a carbon because maybe, just maybe, they'll do tshuva. Because we cannot accept a carbon from a Russia, and that's called Zevech Rishayim Toeva, and therefore he's going to have to do tshuva if he wants us to accept his carbon. So we're motivated to want to accept his carbon, and that's min habehema. Chutz min hamumar. But then we get to a person who's not a posheah b'Yisrael, meaning, on occasion he violates the Torah, but a mumar. He translates mumar as a renegade. I don't know. I don't. That doesn't sit so well with me. But anyway, umenasech es hayayin umechal Shabbos b'farhesia. So although we are makabel a carbon adova from Poshe Yisrael who are Rishonim, but we hope that in the process of preparing to bring their carbon, they'll do tshuva. But when it comes to mechal Shabbos farhesia or avodah zara, which means they do libations of yayin for the purpose of worshiping idols, those we cannot accept their karbanos. So Gemara says, wait a minute. Hagufa kasha, there's an inherent stira in this brisa. Before you ask any kashas on Ravanan regarding an Oved Avodah Zarah and Shchita, first, let's see if the brisa makes any sense internally. Amart, you said Mikem, and Mikem was a miyut, v'lo kulchem, v'lo tzias hamumar, so you excluded a mumar. V'hadai tani, mekablin karbanos miposha Yisrael. So let's have it. What is it? Do we accept a carbon from a mumar or do we not? And the answer, says the Gemara, there are two categories of Poshe Yisrael and Mumar. Halokasha Reisha, when we talk about accepting a carbon from a Poshe Yisrael. I'm sorry. Which was the Reisha? Let me just go over this one more time. Lahotzias HaMumar. When do we reject the carbon of a Mumar? That's only in the case of a Mumar L'Kol Tarkula. He completely scoffs the Torah. He doesn't observe any of the mitzvahs. Mitzvah, but in the second case, where we said that we can accept the carbon of a Poshe Yisrael, that's a Mumar L'Dover Echad. There's one Avera, and he falls short of this Avera. He eats Nevela, let's say, for example, he's not makbid only on kosher food. And although he's a Mumar for that prohibition of eating Nevela and Treifa, but nevertheless, we accept his carbon in the hope that he'll do tshuva in the process of bringing the carbon. But somebody who rejects the entire Torah, he's a mumel called Tarkul, he's like a guy. We're not going to accept his carbon. Amos Seifa. Let's go on to the last case in the Mishnah. One second, in the Brisa. Chutzman amur mezachayayin u mechal shabbosos b'farhesia hai mumar hechidami. Right now we have two categories of mumar. We said that a mumar l'dover echad we accept his carbon. We said that a mumar l'kol tarku we don't accept his carbon. In the seifa where we reject his carbon, what kind of mumar is it? I mumar l'kol tarku l'hainu reisha. You're just repeating yourself. Why would the brisa repeat itself? The mumar l'dover echad, and we just finished saying that we accept a carbon from a mumar l'dover echad is kasha mitziyasa lav hachi kamar chutz min hamumar l'nasech es hayayin l'chal shabbos farhesia. These two cases are cases of a mumar l'dover echad which are considered halachically. They're upgraded, if you could use that term, to the status of a mumar l'kol tarkula. Because Shabbos is shakol keneged kol tarkula. Anyone who denies Shabbos, it's as if he denies Ma'aser Bereishis, the creation. And anyone who worships an idol, it's as if he denies the whole Torah. Alma, we see from this, against Ravanan, that mumar la'avodas kol mumar l'kol tarkula. And again, although the Brisa is talking about bringing karbanos, but once the Brisa established that we don't accept a carbon from a mumar la'avodas kol chavim, because a mumar la'avodas kol chavim is considered a mumar l'kol tarkula, that has repercussions as far as shchita is concerned. He's a guy, we cannot accept his shchita. Tiyufta d'Ravanan, tiyufta. So now the Gemara wants to suggest the following. We finished saying that the source for rejecting the carbon of a mumar is the word mikem, and that was the brisa that we had. So the Gemara now asks, "V'hame hachanafka." Is it really from the word mikem that we derive the conclusion that a mumar's carbon is rejected? May hasam nafka. We're going to quote a second brisa that comes to the same identical halachic ruling, namely that we don't accept a carbon from a mumar, but from a different pasuk entirely.